Good morning. Welcome to Cool Springs. Today is Sunday, August the 3rd, 2025, and we are starting a new series for the month of August. Today on the Jewish calendar happens to be the 9th of Av. They have a lunar calendar, we have a solar one, so it doesn't always fall on the same date every year. But the 9th of Av on the Jewish calendar was the date in history when both Solomon's temple and the second temple, commonly called Herod's temple, were knocked down by the Babylonians and the Romans respectively. And so it's a day of mourning and fasting. And I'm mentioning this now not only because today is the date of it. Their holidays go from sunset the day before through sunset of the day of a holiday. It's because those of you who've been paying attention to the biblical prophecy stuff need to note that Ben-Gvir, who is one of the Israeli cabinet members, very, very conservative fellow, led a group up on the Temple Mount earlier today because it is the 9th of Av, and they did public prayer on the Temple Mount. Of course, the Arabs are all upset about it, but that they are calling for Messiah to come because this is such a historically important date. So if you want to, you can go on YouTube and just type up Ben-Gvir visits Temple Mount, and you can see the short little video of it. The series that we're going to be doing here at the church for the month of August is called Faith Over Fear, and I'm going to go to the board for just a moment here and show it to you today. The overall theme is faith over fear, because we have to live out our faith even in times when we are afraid, when we are utterly broken, when tragedy has struck and we don't understand. And so each of the lessons we're going to look at during the month will deal with hanging on to faith when your world is shaken. And today we're going to look at living your faith in exile, Daniel and friends, and I'm going to speed walk you through Daniel chapters 1 through 6. Next week, we're going to look at living your faith under persecution. And our focal person for that will be Stephen. Then we're going to look at faith as a victory, which will include Esther and also Josiah, the last good king of Israel. Then the next two Sundays, this is a bad time of year for me, but one of the coping skills that I've learned in the last few years is you find a way to carry on, and really that's kind of a theme for this. You find a way to carry on when your mind and heart are in pieces, when you're not sure what to do, you find a way to carry on. And so some of the Sundays in this month are days that are going to be particularly rough days, and we're going to pre-record those and set those days to podcast on time on Sunday morning. August 24th is going to be one of those days that will be taped and then podcast, because we'll be talking about death and eternal life, and the fact that when a person who is a believer dies, for the ones they leave behind, it is the worst of days. But for the person who has just stepped into the arms of Jesus and received their eternal reward, for them it is the best of days. Then we're going to look at Malachi, who is part of this Faith Over Fear series, because he's the last of the Old Testament prophets, and he's going to give God's message, and there will be a 400-year period when God is silent, when the people are continuing to worship or to go through the motions of worship for the majority of them, and God is withholding an answer. And that definitely belongs in our faith over fear, because a lot of times we want God to answer our prayers, and we want Him to answer them the way we want Him to. And when He delays His answer, or when the answer is not the one we were hoping for, it can shake you to your very core. And so Malachi is going to point out God's covenant of love that continues even when we break God's heart. You know, a lot of times we focus on, God, how could you let this happen to me? I'm wounded, I'm hurt. And we don't focus as much as we should on all the times and all the ways that we break God's heart. And so Malachi is going to talk to us about God's covenant of love. He's going to call out the truth, the fact that the people were unfaithful and the religious leaders were being unfaithful too. So God couldn't talk to them because they weren't listening anyway. And how the faithful Lord returns for his own. Because Malachi ends up with that promise of there's going to be a forerunner and Messiah is soon to appear. So that's an overview of what we're going to be looking at in the month of August. Next week, you might want to read ahead in Acts chapter 7 and 8, the story of Stephen, to get you ready for what we'll be talking about next Sunday. Now I'm going to flip the board here and give you today's notes. Because like I said, I'm going to speed walk you through it. Daniel and his friends. Their world was shattered. They were teenage boys being raised there in Jerusalem, in Judah, worshiping God, trying to live their lives and their families living their lives. But because the nation had been unfaithful to God, the nation fell under judgment. And so Daniel and his friends experienced exile from their home. They and their families are snatched out of their homes by the Babylonians, and they're force-marched all the way to Babylon, a distance of somewhere between 700 to 1,200 miles, depending on how far up they walked to get to the river, because nobody would go straight across the desert. Now they're in a foreign land. Bad enough to see your nation overtaken by an enemy and you being subject to a foreign power. Worse, to be snatched out of your homes and marched off to a foreign country, never, ever to return. But then, when they get to that new land of Babylon, these teenagers are taken from their parents' homes. Mom and dad didn't get the chance to finish raising their sons. They were forcibly snatched from their home and put into Nebuchadnezzar's pagan university, where the goal was, we're going to take some of these young exiles and we're going to retrain them and tell them everything they've been taught all their lives by their parents is wrong. And we're going to retrain them our way so that they'll grow up to help us manage the rest of the people. And they're going to be put to the test. And so we're going to look at that in just a moment. Chapter 2, they're still in school. Now their lives are being threatened through no fault of their own, because Nebuchadnezzar, the foreign king, has had a dream that he doesn't understand. And he's got all these counselors that these young people are being trained up to become. But the ones who are already older adult counselors, Nebuchadnezzar has a sneaky feeling that they're just blowing smoke up his skirts, that they're just telling him what they think he wants to hear. So he decides it's time to test out to see if these people really are telling the truth. Let them tell me what I dreamed, and then I'll believe their interpretation. And of course they can't do it. And Nebuchadnezzar's reaction is, well, then kill everybody. The ones who can't tell me the dream, the grown-ups, and the teenagers who are still in school learning how to be those counselors. But Daniel's able to do it with God's revelation. Then in chapter 3, Daniel isn't even in the story. He's probably gone somewhere on a mission for the king, but it's the other three friends who have to learn how to stand and be bold in their faith without their leader, Daniel, being there to comfort them and to give them some wisdom. Then in chapter 4, Daniel's now mid-career, and Nebuchadnezzar's had another dream, and Daniel's called in to interpret it. And Daniel has to have the courage to speak truth to power, even if it might cost him something. Then in chapter 5, Daniel's now a senior citizen. Started out as a teenager, mid-career, now an old man called out of retirement, again, to speak truth to power. He's lived a consistent life. Then finally we see Daniel, who's been now called back to office, even though he had retired, to serve a different king. And this time that king is tricked into putting Daniel in a lion's den. And there's Daniel, again, having confidence in God, even when his life is under severe threat. So now we're going to go to the table and we're going to look at each of these in detail in the next 45 minutes or so. It's a lot of material to cover, but the book of Daniel, which is 12 chapters, really can be broken up into two parts. The first part is stuff that happened to Daniel and his friends in their lifetime. And then the last part from chapters 7 through 12. Daniel's now an old man, and he's having visions and dreams that he doesn't understand, and Daniel doesn't have a Daniel to interpret for him. So he does the only reasonable thing when you're afraid and you don't understand what's happening or why God allowed something to happen. There's a couple of reactions that people can have. You can get angry at God. You can go to a dark place mentally, emotionally, whether you're blaming God or whether you're living with the trifecta of regret yourself, the coulda, shoulda, wouldas, what if I had only, what if this person had only, and you can go to some very, very, very dark places emotionally if you choose to go down that path. Or you can trust God even when you don't understand. And so the last half of the book of Daniel, Daniel's an old man who's gone through all these experiences that we're about to talk about. And he's learned to walk by faith even when he doesn't see why God's doing what he's doing. And now he's having these visions and he doesn't understand them. And so he decides, I'm going to devote myself to fasting and prayer. And God sends the angel Gabriel to tell him, Daniel, this is what you dreamed back in chapters 7 and 8 and 9 through 12. Here's what's going to happen in the future, Daniel, to your people, the Jewish people. And even after Gabriel tells him what's going to happen in the end times, Daniel's mind is just blown in 1,000 directions. And he says, I heard, but I didn't understand. And Gabriel's response to him is, it's okay, Daniel. You go to your rest. These things that you've seen are for many, many years in the future. You go to your rest, and you will rise at the appointed time. And that's something that you and I need to really get a grip on when life comes up and just bites us hard. You may not get every answer. Probably won't get every answer. You may not understand why, God, why in this lifetime. But when you know absolutely that you belong to God, that God has the future in his hands because he's revealed it already through his servants, the prophets, then you can confidently know that whenever your time here on earth is done and you take your last breath here on earth and your heart stops beating, that you instantly step into eternity and you take your first breath and your heart comes alive again in the presence of the God who loved you. You have a future to look forward to. Daniel was told, Daniel, these things are for way off in the future. You go to your rest and you will arise at the appointed time. You and I have an appointment with God. We have an appointment for a call to salvation. We have an appointed time to leave this earth and an appointed time to stand before the Lord. And those who put their faith and trust in him can stand before the Lord confident that we're not being judged for our sins because he's already paid our sin penalty. Our sins are covered. That we're only being judged for the level of reward that we're going to get for our faithfulness to Him. So we need to spend this month talking about people in the Bible who have had faith but also had fear, who've had heartbreak, who've had disaster upon disaster come upon them, who've had things happen that they don't understand, and yet they're able to hang on to God in the worst possible moments because we know God's got our future securely in His hands. So Daniel chapter 1, they've been hauled into exile. They've been given new names when they were snatched out of their parents' homes. Mom and Dad now can't do anything to stop the government from reprogramming their kids. In our day and time, a lot of parents have been showing up at school board meetings and finding that the government system, instead of defending and protecting and respecting the right of the mother and the father to decide what is morally correct for my child, to defend their child's safety and their dignity, they're finding that sometimes government officials turn on them. Parents have been arrested. Parents have been kicked out of school board meetings. School officials have done things and put things in kids' minds without parents' knowledge or permission, things that parents would absolutely find morally repugnant. Well, Daniel's family and his 3 friends' families were experiencing that 600 years BC. Their boys are snatched out of their homes because the government decides we just want to take them. The government was looking for people who looked healthy, looked good, promising young people. Sometimes beauty can be more of a curse than a blessing. Outward beauty. That's the way the government was looking at it. And so they snatched Daniel and Hananiah and Azariah and Mishael, 3 teenage boys, out of mom and dad's home, and mom and dad can't stop it. The government just took their sons away from them, has placed them in, for lack of a better phrase to call it, Babylon's pagan university, where they're going to tell them everything your mom and dad have ever taught you is wrong. The God you worship, He's a nobody. Even if He exists, He's a lesser God than ours, and we're going to retrain you to do things our way. We're going to retrain your mind. The Babylonians are there to poison these young men, spiritually and mentally poison them. And they've got to decide, am I going to cave in and go along with the government and compromise my principles? Or is the faith that mom and dad have been trying to teach me something I'm going to claim for myself and hang on to? They're not the only 4 boys taken. There are a lot of younger Jewish men who are snatched out of their parents' homes and put into pagan youth. And most of them compromise a little bit. Then it becomes a little bit easier until finally they have swallowed hook, line, and sinker the poison that their professors at Pagan U are putting into their heads. So is Daniel chapters 1 through 6 something that's relevant to our day and time? Oh, yeah. Moms and dads, you definitely want to go and reread this. Young people need to go and read this, because if you're a young person today, you're the Daniels, the Hananiah, the Mishaels, and the Azariahs, and you need to learn how to stand tall for God, even when there's enormous peer pressure and government coercion and other kinds of threats, when it would be so easy to jettison everything morally that mom and dad have taught you and accept the evil as though it was good. Look what happens to these 4 young people, Daniel and his 3 friends, in just the first chapter. You're kicked out of your country. You're force marched a long, long distance to a pagan land where you're going to spend the rest of your life. You're snatched from your parents' home and you're thrown into this pagan setting where other people are telling you, this is what you're going to think from now on. This is how you're going to dress. This is what you're going to eat. And oh, by the way, you don't get to keep your names because the names that your parents gave you are names that honor that God of yours, that God that our gods defeated. And so we're going to give you slave names that all honor our gods. Gods plural, because the Babylonians worshiped many. So Daniel, whose name is God is my judge, is renamed Belteshazzar. And the thing that you should notice when you're reading the book of Daniel, particularly these first 6 chapters, is that even though he has been assigned a new name, they didn't change his pronouns, they tried to change his whole personality. You're no longer Daniel, the man whose name means God is my judge. Bel is God. That is your name now. Daniel is going to still be called Daniel, even by the pagans. By the time we get to chapters 5 and 6, when Daniel is a senior citizen, and those professors at Pagan U are long since gone, and his parents are probably long since gone, and now Daniel's in his 80s himself, the Babylonians and then the Medo-Persian, Darius, are going to call him Daniel. They're not going to call him Belteshazzar. His life was such a consistent walk for God that they came around to calling him by his right name rather than the slave name that they gave him. His other 3 friends, Hananiah, God is my helper, Azariah, and Mishael, who is like God, God is my defender. Those are those boys' names. They changed them to the names of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And when we hear them referred to after chapter 1, they're being called by their slave names. But they're still standing tall for God. So they're now in Pagan U. They've been given slave names. And now they're being offered the king's rich food to eat. Because other than mutilating their bodies, he's had them turned into eunuchs so that they can never have the privilege of having children of their own. And he's renamed them, and he's taken them away from their parents. Other than that, he's being pretty good to them. He's offering them the choicest, richest junk food, the stuff that everybody likes to eat. And they have a choice. Compromise a little bit. Oh, it smells good. It looks good. Yesterday, I was in Atlanta for a reunion of the youth group at my church from when I was a teenager. The youth group now are all in our 60s. A couple of them have reached 70, but the youth group is now in the 60s and a few in the 70s. And I was sitting next to a young man who was not only my neighbor, but he was our pastor's son when we were growing up as teenagers. Because the pastor's home was one door down. We had one poor Methodist family that lived in this sea of Baptists on our street. And Chris was telling a story about the fact that his dad, who was our pastor for like 8 or 9 years, 6'3", built like a linebacker. One of the men in the church had been a cook in the Navy and knew how to bake really tasty treats to bring to the church fellowships. And this man had discovered that Preacher Ivy liked his cinnamon rolls. So sometimes he would show up at the pastor's house on Sunday morning, fresh out of the oven, big old pan of cinnamon rolls. And Chris was telling the story about how his mama would just shake her head and try to tell this particular church member, Ray doesn't need that, because she was wanting Ray to eat healthy and not be built like the inside linebacker. But this man's gift was the gift of baking. And he was showing love to the pastor by bringing the pastor the cinnamon rolls that he didn't need to eat. But it was so good and so tasty that Ray wouldn't say no to it. He would just eat them. Well, think of the food that Daniel and his friends is being offered as the cinnamon rolls. You know that you need to watch your weight. You know that you don't need to take in too much sugar. But oh boy, does it look good, and oh boy, does it smell good, and when you finally put it to your mouth, oh boy, does it taste good. That's what Daniel and his friends are facing when they're being offered the king's food. This choice wine, this meat that's been prepared in such a savory manner. Oh, but it's meat that's been offered to idols. And some of it is food that isn't kosher to eat in the first place. And they have to decide. Am I going to listen to what Mom and Dad used to tell me about what's good to eat and what isn't? Am I going to eat the food that the king is offering, that everybody else is eating? Or am I going to stick with what Mom and Dad taught me? These are teenagers having to make some important decisions, and Mom's not there to snatch the cinnamon roll off the plate. Mom's not there to give the disapproving look to say, you shouldn't be eating that. Dad's not there to say, now son, what have we been trying to tell you? They've got to decide on their own. They can't even do like we can do in the 21st century and whip out the cell phone or send a text message or FaceTime, any of those things. Mom, Dad, what do you think? These guys have got to make up their mind right then and there. What am I going to do? And most of their friends just sat right there at the table and started indulging. But when it says in chapter 1 that Daniel determined in his heart that he wasn't going to do this, Daniel and his 3 friends, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, having to answer to slave names, they decided, you know what, guys? We know God says no to this. And so when it says Daniel determined in his heart, it wasn't just him. He at least had a small core group of good friends, godly friends. And that was something we talked about at that youth group reunion yesterday, that the people that we hung out with in high school were either people from our own church or kids from neighboring churches where we all went to the same high school but maybe went to 2 or 3 different churches in the community. The church kids tended to hang out with the other church kids. You stayed out of a whole lot of trouble that way. Sometimes troublemaker kids can be in churches too. But yeah, God loves troublemakers. God wants troublemakers in his house so that he can help them see the light. Daniel and his friends, when it says that he determined, it really means they sat on their heart. They decided, you know what? We're going to be polite. We're going to ask the captain of the guard to please let us just have the food we know is okay to eat, the vegetables and the water, and put us to the test for 10 days. Because the official was like, I can't say yes to that. If the king sees you looking less healthy than the other kids, he'll have my head for this. Please, sir, just put us to the test. Try it out for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, we know from Daniel chapter 1 that the officials, sure enough, realized Daniel and his buddies, they do look healthier after just that short of a period of time. And so he let them continue. But when you go back to that, Daniel and his friends, determined, they had made up their minds. They asked politely for the 10-day test so that official, Arioch, could have a chance to see that what they were asking for was right and proper and good. But at the end of the 10 days, even if Arioch had said, nope, I'm not gonna risk this any further, here's the only food you're going to be given to eat. Daniel and his friends had made up his mind that even if it meant going on a hunger strike and starving to death, the one thing they would not do was defile their bodies by taking the king's food. So they have passed several tests emotionally of seeing something happen that they don't understand. They've been raised in godly homes, but their nation as a whole has been unfaithful to God. And now, as a consequence of it, the good people, as well as the people who weren't obeying God, all the people are suffering. And you can see how it might shake their faith to see the foreign army come in and order them to get out of their houses, come with us, put them in chains, and force march them. The equivalent distance would be like you and I going halfway across the United States, on foot, in chains, as slaves. And still trust a God who let something like that happen to you and your nation. And then they get there, and they're trying to settle into the new homes. And all of a sudden, here comes the king's soldiers. You, come with me. And mom and dad can't stop the police from dragging you out of the house and taking you away. And now they've put you in this pagan university, and they're telling you this is what you're going to learn. Everything you've been told all your life is a lie and is wrong, and we're going to reprogram your brain. And now food. And they've passed that first test. When you get to chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar's had this dream. It scares him. He doesn't understand the dream. Like I said earlier, he's already suspicious of his own officials, his own astrologers and magicians and wise men and sorcerers who claimed to know what the signs of the universe are, what the spirit world is saying, who claim to speak for God. Somehow Nebuchadnezzar has enough sense, common sense to know something doesn't smell right here. So he's decided to put him to the test. Tell me what I dreamed, and then I'll believe your interpretation. And their response to this is, no king in all of history has ever asked such a thing. Nobody can do this. And that part, they're right. No human being can tell you what you're thinking, what you're dreaming. As far as that goes, they were spot on. But remember, up until this point, they have claimed the ability to interpret the king's dreams, to give the king this special word of knowledge from the spirit world beyond. And so he's putting them to the test. And when they can't do what he's asked them to do, to prove it, give me something I can prove. If you can tell me what I dreamed, then I'll accept what you're saying. But if not, I'll know you're trying to hose me. Telling a person who is unreasonable that he's being unreasonable, not exactly going to win the argument for you. When they tell Nebuchadnezzar, sir, you're asking for something unreasonable. Nobody can do this. Now he's ticked off because all this time they have been claiming to know the things of God, to know the spiritual things. And so he orders them all rounded up, put them all to death. And by having them rounded up, he also wants the professors who are teaching Daniel and his friends in the pagan university to get rounded up, because Daniel and his friends are being taught. This is the wisdom of the world, and you're training up to follow us as the next counselors. So they're under a life threat. Arioch, the captain of the guard, the one who had agreed to the 10-day test just to see if they'd look healthier after eating healthy, choice meals for 10 days, as opposed to the other kids who immediately caved in, went along with the peer group, went along with the pressure. Government says this is what you got to do. Okay, we'll do it. Arioch's already seen, okay, Daniel and his friends, sure enough, they do seem healthier. Sure enough, they are making the good grades. Sure enough, their behavior is better than the other young people. He's been ordered now to go round them all up and have them executed. Yes, it's an illegal, immoral type of order, the way we would understand rules of today. But what's going to happen to Arioch if he doesn't do what the king says to do? He will be killed himself. So he goes to start rounding them up. And he goes and he knocks on Daniel's door and he tells him why he's there. And Daniel tells him, don't do it. Really? Teenage boy in year 2 of his 3-year training program, you're telling me to disobey the king's direct orders? But you see, he's already had a little bit of experience with Daniel and his friends. Hey, there's something different about these boys. There's something special about these young people. And so Arioch is actually going to listen to Daniel. He's going to have to put himself on the line a little bit, because Arioch's going to have to go back to the king and tell him, sir, one of those young people in the training program, that guy from the Exiles, Daniel, whom we've renamed Belteshazzar, he asked for a little bit of time and he said he'll be able to interpret your dream. Nebuchadnezzar's going to give that little bit of time. What's Daniel going to do? Daniel's not going to try to go it alone. He's not going to try to be the Lone Ranger Christian. Daniel's going to call on the 3 friends who've stuck with him in the food matter. Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael. We need to have a prayer meeting. And they all agreed to pray together that God would give Daniel the interpretation, not just to save their lives, because their lives are at risk, but also to save the professors at Pagan U who've been trying to poison them for the last 2 years with filling their heads full of garbage. God will reveal the dream to Daniel. And in chapter 2, Daniel is going to be brought into the king's presence. Arioch's got to bring him. It's not just Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel and Arioch standing there. All those adults who've already been trained to be the wise men and the sorcerers and the conjurers, doing all kinds of evil, wicked things but calling it good, they're in the audience too. The strange thing is, Daniel, the teenager who just won't do what they tell him to do, won't swallow the philosophies that they're trying to fill his head full of. If Daniel's able to tell the king the dream, it's not only going to spare Daniel's life and his buddies' lives, it's going to spare the lives of those adults who've been spending all this time trying to poison him, spiritually and mentally. Daniel goes in, and in chapter 2, starting in verse 31, you, O king, Daniel is just starting to tell the king, this is what you dreamed. You, O king, were looking, and behold, there was a single great statue. That statue, which was large and of extraordinary splendor, was standing in front of you, and its appearance was awesome. The head of that statue was made of fine gold, its breast and arms were silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partially iron and partially clay. You continued looking until a stone was cut out without hands, and it struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and crushed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were all crushed at the same time and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. You take like a dandelion and it goes blowing away in the wind like chaff from the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away so that no trace of them was found. But the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. This was the dream. Now we will tell its interpretation. If there were such a thing as a time machine and you could go backwards in time, this would make my top 10 list of rooms I'd want to be in. As Daniel is giving detail after detail after detail. He's not just giving broad strokes. A lot of times when people try to go and visit palm readers or somebody who's gazing into a crystal ball, those charlatans are picking up on clues. Sometimes they're asking questions and you don't realize you're giving them answers. But they're looking at clues like the way you're dressed, the kind of jewelry or watches you may be wearing, how your hairstyle is done. And they're picking up on these clues and they're telling you stuff that they think you want to hear. But it's just vague enough to where it's open to interpretation. That's not what Daniel's doing here. He's giving Nebuchadnezzar detail after detail after detail. This is what you dreamed. And I imagine Nebuchadnezzar's probably sitting there and at first just kind of idly listening like, yeah, right, you're going to tell me what I dreamed. Nobody else can do it, including men who've been doing this longer than you, kid. And the more detail Daniel gave, the more Nebuchadnezzar would have been paying attention, maybe leaning forward, maybe his jaw dropping, as Daniel accurately tells him in great detail, this is what you dreamed. Now, here's the interpretation. And Daniel's going to go on and giving him the interpretation that's going to last for several verses there. And we drop down, just for time's sake, to verse 44. In those days, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed. And that kingdom will not be left for another people. It will crush and put an end to all these kingdoms, and it will itself endure forever. Inasmuch as you saw that a stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it crushed the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God, Daniel is talking about, Nebuchadnezzar, you want to know what you dreamed? Here's what you dreamed. Here's what it means. And here's how I know it. Because my God really is God. Daniel, God is my judge. Not Belteshazzar honoring the pagan god Bel that Nebuchadnezzar worshipped. Daniel's proclaiming God's truth. He's giving credit to God for this. The great God who has made known to the king what will take place in the future. So the dream is true and its interpretation is trustworthy. You might want to highlight verse 45 there. Daniel basically just said, Nebuchadnezzar, here's what you dreamed in detail. Here's what it means. The reason I know it is because the great God, the real God, not those pagan gods, the real God has revealed it to me. There you go. The answer is trustworthy. Almost probably standing there with folded hands. Take it or leave it. And the rest of the crowd's probably going like that, dropping jaws. But look what Nebuchadnezzar does when Daniel makes that statement. Verse 46. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face and did homage to Daniel. What? The pagan king who had the power of life or death over everybody in the kingdom, everybody in the room. The hothead who said, oh, you got to tell me what I dreamed before I'll believe your interpretation of it. He just heard a whole truckload of truth, and the king's reaction is to get off the throne and go face down and pay honor to the teenage slave boy whom he's had renamed because Nebuchadnezzar realizes there's something special about this boy. He's just told me the dream. And he was right. He was spot on. And he's giving credit to Daniel and Daniel's God. And he gave orders to present him an offering and fragrant incense. The king answered Daniel and said, surely your God is a God of gods and the Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, since you've been able to reveal this mystery. The rest of the crowd's probably going, huh? And then also, whew, at the same time, Daniel just saved all their lives. And Nebuchadnezzar has had an encounter with God. He's recognized Daniel's worshiping a God who really can do things. But Nebuchadnezzar isn't exactly a convert yet. He's had an encounter with God, but he hasn't yet given his heart to God. Because what's going to happen in chapter 3? Daniel's just told him, Nebuchadnezzar, you are the head of gold, and there are going to be kingdoms that follow you. Like so many of us, Nebuchadnezzar, when he's had his first encounter with Daniel's God, through Daniel's testimony, Nebuchadnezzar decides he's going to hear what he wants to hear out of it. Because in chapter 3, a little bit of time has passed. Daniel has now been appointed to office in government. He just got graduated without having to finish school. And oh, by the way, your 3 friends that you mentioned to the king, they just got promoted and graduated, and now they're all serving as officials of the government. In chapter 3, Daniel's not even present. The best we know is that he must have been on some mission for the king. But the king heard what he wanted to hear about this statue with the head of gold. And Nebuchadnezzar, your kingdom, you are the head of gold. But instead of listening to the rest of it about the chest of silver and the belly of bronze and the legs of iron kingdoms that were going to follow his, Nebuchadnezzar has a 90-foot-high statue made of nothing but solid gold. A statue to himself. And he orders everybody, when you hear the sound of the music playing, you fall down and worship. And anybody that doesn't worship my statue, and the key word there is my, Nebuchadnezzar wants people worshiping him. He's had an encounter with God, but he hasn't had a salvation experience yet with God. He orders everybody to bow down to that statue. Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, they're working for the government. They're on the civil service payroll. They're still there in Babylon. They're not on a foreign mission somewhere. They're still having to answer to the slave names of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, honoring pagan gods. They don't do it. We wouldn't eat the king's food when we were teenagers. Now that we're 20-somethings, we're not bowing down and worshiping an idol because we know what we were taught. And we believed it for ourselves. And they immediately get reported and turned in. And Nebuchadnezzar hears about it and he summons them. And he's going to give them a second chance because he likes what they've been doing, working for the government. I hear that you have disobeyed my direct order to fall down and worship that statue when you hear the sound of the music. I'll give you a second chance, fellas. If, when you hear the sound of the music again, you'll fall down and worship, then all will be well. Yeah, like Nebuchadnezzar's not going to forget that they disobeyed a direct order. But if not, you will be immediately, not 6 months from now, we're not going to set you in prison and give you a chance to think about it. If not, you will immediately be bound up and thrown into the fiery furnace and burned alive. And Nebuchadnezzar is going to ask a question. And what God can save you from me? You see, Nebuchadnezzar knows about God. He's got head knowledge. But he hadn't made Daniel's God God of his own heart. So he asked the question, what God can save you from me? Well, be careful what you ask for. You just might get it. Nebuchadnezzar's going to get his answer because the young men reply back, King, you ought to know better than to ask us this. Oh, yeah, they said it respectfully, but they're letting him know, King, you should know better than this. We worship God. We can't do what you're asking us to do. What you're asking us to do is morally wrong, and we will not do it. Even if we die. Yet you ask, who can save us from you? Our God can. They had that kind of confidence in the face of death. Ours can. But even if God chooses not to answer our prayers the way we want them, if God chooses not to rescue us, if today is the day we're going to die, know this, O King, we're going to go down standing up. We're going to die the way we live. We're going to serve the one true God, not you. Well, Nebuchadnezzar is now very hot under the collar. He has all kinds of flammable clothes put on him. He has them tied up with ropes. He has his best soldiers carry him up to the top of this 2-story furnace and throw him in. In fact, the heat is so bad that it kills the soldiers who throw the young men into the furnace. And Nebuchadnezzar and all those counselors, those pagan university folks, and his sorcerers and conjurers, they're there watching, the yes men. And they've just seen these 3 being tossed alive into the fiery furnace. And Nebuchadnezzar keeps looking. It's one thing maybe to be on the road and you can tell that there's been an accident, and when it's finally your turn to inch past the accident, you want to look for a brief second just to try to see what happened or to see if everybody's okay. But would you really want to sit there or stand there and watch somebody burn to death and do nothing to try to put out the fire? There's something really fundamentally sick about Nebuchadnezzar and his advisors, that they're watching, hopefully, gleefully, thinking they're going to hear the screams of people dying in a horrible, horrible way to die. But Nebuchadnezzar doesn't see what he thinks he's going to see. Didn't we? Because trouble loves company. People who want to do things wrong always want to get buddies involved so they can share the blame or point the finger when things go south. Didn't we throw 3 men into the furnace? And all the sycophants, the yes men, oh, yes, sir, 6 bags full. Yeah, that's what we did. They didn't do it. Nebuchadnezzar did it. But they're telling him what he wants to hear. But I see 4 men in the furnace. And one of them looks like a son of the gods. Nebuchadnezzar's having another opportunity, another divine encounter. He was expecting those guys to be screaming in agony as they're bound up, unable to move, and are being burned alive. And instead, they're walking around in a furnace and they're fine. They don't come out until he tells them to come out. And they're not singed. Their clothes aren't damaged. They're fine. They've been literally through the flames because God chose to miraculously deliver them and to reach out to Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar then realizes, I messed up with this statue, and he's now ordering people to worship God. And he's going to worship God too, but he's not quite there yet because in chapter 4, he's going to have another dream. Some time has passed. And he's asked Daniel, what does this dream mean? And Daniel tells him, King, I wish this was about anybody but you. Because Nebuchadnezzar is so full of pride that God's going to let him be crazy for 7 years. He's going to start living out among the animals. His hair's going to grow wild. His nails are going to grow long. He's going to eat the grass like the animals. He'll lose his mind for 7 years. And when he finally comes to his senses, Nebuchadnezzar will finally come to faith in God. Because Daniel and his friends have stayed consistent. From their teenage years through adulthood, they've relied on God. Then you get to chapters 5 and 6. Daniel's got to talk to Belshazzar, who's followed Nebuchadnezzar, about that disembodied hand on the wall. And he tells Belshazzar the truth. Belshazzar, you've seen the testimony of your grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar. You know what God has done, but you still haven't given your heart to him. And Belshazzar, you've offended God, you keep rejecting God, and you've run out of second chances. And that night, the Babylonians are going to fall to the Medo-Persians. And in chapter 6, Daniel's now a very old man. He's long since been called out of retirement. He's been put back in charge of a lot of those satraps and governors. But they're jealous of him because he's not from their racial ethnic group. And they're looking for something they can accuse him of to get him in trouble with the king. And they admit, we're not going to find anything on him unless it's got something to do with his religion. He's lived a consistent life. When we're dealing with our own fears, with our own heartbreak, with our hurts, we've got to be consistent. The God of the good times is still God in the bad times. The God of the day is still God of the night, to borrow a song from Linda Randall. When life hits the fan and beats you up, the way to get through it is not to get angry at God, not to start doubting God, not to wonder, God, why is this happening to me or to somebody I love? It's to do like Daniel and his friends. Hang in there and trust God even when you have no clue why, and even when your heart is broken. Next week, we're going to look at Stephen. God's not going to spare Stephen from being stoned to death like he spared Daniel and his friends from being put to death numerous times. Stephen's going to die a martyr's death. But as he's about to die, he sees Jesus not sitting there waiting to welcome him home, but standing to receive him. The Lord is ready to receive you and me. The day of our death isn't necessarily the worst day. It may be a bad day for the people that you leave behind who love you. But you step into God's comforting presence, alive and well, and it's the best day for you. Acts chapter 7 and 8 for next week. Thanks for watching.